Raghav Verma, Sameer Thakur, Priya Mehra, and Arjun Kapoor were bound by secrets, lies, and a web of crimes that spanned continents. But none of them knew that the walls of a U.S. prison would turn betrayal into a deadly game from which only one could survive. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. Raghav Verma's first hours inside the U.S. federal prison felt like a slow descent into a world he was never meant to enter. The air was thick with the smell of metal, sweat, and old concrete. He walked down the long corridor with shackles around his ankles, listening to the sharp echo of each step. Every sound magnified his fear. He kept his eyes low, avoiding the stares of inmates who watched him with a mix of curiosity and cold assessment. Raghav had always been a quiet man, someone who preferred numbers over people, but here silence felt dangerous. Inside cell 47, he sat on the thin mattress and tried to steady his breathing, yet his thoughts kept racing back to the life he had lost. Just a month earlier, he had been working at a small accounting firm in Delhi, living in a rented apartment and planning to send money home. Now he was thousands of miles away in a place where survival depended not on intelligence but on instinct. And instinct was something he lacked. During those early days, he noticed how the prison operated like its own world. Each group had its territory, each inmate had a role, and each guard carried the weight of routine indifference. Raghav avoided confrontations, but that only made him stand out. Some inmates whispered about him, calling him the fragile one, a label he hated but couldn't escape. He tried to stay invisible, sitting in corners during meal times and keeping his head down in the yard. But invisibility came with its own curse. Anyone could decide to test him, and he would have no one to defend him. He once overheard two inmates mentioning his case. They had found it strange that a simple accountant had landed in an American prison instead of facing charges in India. That curiosity made him uneasy. He feared questions because the truth was far more complicated than what the court had heard. Nights were the worst. The prison grew quieter, but the silence carried unsettling noises. Metal clanks, distant shouts, footsteps that seemed to pause near his cell. Raghav slept lightly, waking up at the slightest sound. Sometimes he felt someone watching him, and although he told himself it was just his imagination, the dread never left. He often pressed his back firmly against the wall, as if the concrete could protect him from threats he couldn't see. One guard noticed his nervous behavior and wrote in the daily log that inmate Verma showed signs of extreme anxiety. But in a place filled with chaos, one man's fear was just another line in a file that no one would prioritize. Inside his cell, he kept thinking about the decision that had brought him here. He remembered the day he had received documents to sign, papers he didn't fully understand but was pressured into completing. He had believed it was harmless work, part of a routine financial audit. Only later did he realize the documents linked him to a large-scale fraud. By then, the real masterminds had disappeared, leaving him as the easiest target. Even now, inside this prison, he suspected that those people still controlled his fate. The idea that they could reach him, even here, kept him awake more than the prison noise ever could. Every passing day deepened his fear, and although he tried to calm himself, Raghav knew one truth with painful clarity. He was not built for this place, and the prison knew it too. Raghav's case file sat thick and untouched for months before his conviction, filled with numbers, transactions, and confusing financial trails that investigators struggled to understand. What stood out most was how carefully the fraud had been designed. It involved multiple shell companies, foreign accounts, and forged signatures. Yet when authorities traced everything back, the only name that appeared consistently was his. It seemed too neat to be real, too organized for a simple accountant with no criminal history or known connections. But Raghav never tried to fight back. He accepted the charges without offering explanations, leaving many officials puzzled. Some believed he was guilty but inexperienced. Others suspected he was protecting someone. What no one realized was how dangerous the truth actually was. Before moving to the United States for a short-term accounting contract, Raghav had worked under a group of businessmen in Delhi who handled high-risk investments. At first, he thought they were merely wealthy clients with complicated portfolios. Their offices looked legitimate, their staff professional, and their demands precise. But slowly, he noticed odd instructions, requests to adjust numbers in ways that didn't make sense, or to transfer funds to companies that seemed to appear and disappear overnight. Whenever he hesitated, he received subtle warnings disguised as friendly reminders. He knew better than to question people with influence, so he complied, hoping the strange tasks would eventually stop. They didn't. Instead, he found himself deeper in paperwork he no longer understood. Unknown to him, his signature had been replicated and placed on documents that connected him to fraudulent international transfers. When the scheme was uncovered, the masterminds vanished without a trace. Raghav, the most replaceable link in the chain, became the perfect scapegoat. He didn't expose the truth because exposure meant naming people powerful enough to silence him permanently. He feared them far more than the criminal charges. At least the law followed rules. Those men didn't. When he arrived in the United States for what he believed was a routine audit, authorities arrested him at the airport. The evidence was overwhelming. The transactions traced back to his accounts, his authorization codes, his digital footprints. Even the money trail pointed directly at him. Raghav felt his world collapse. But what terrified him more was knowing that the people responsible would not hesitate to eliminate him if he attempted to clear his name. He decided to remain silent, telling himself that imprisonment in a foreign country was safer than crossing the path of the unknown network he had accidentally served. Inside prison, his refusal to speak turned mysterious. Some officers thought he was hiding millions. Others believed he was part of a bigger organization. Prison gossip painted him as everything from a criminal genius to a nervous pawn, but the truth was simpler, and far more tragic. He was trapped between the justice system and a hidden syndicate capable of reaching anyone, anywhere. Each day he stayed silent, but the weight of his secret never left him. He lived with the constant fear that his past would eventually find him, even behind the bars he thought would protect him. Raghav had barely begun to adjust to prison life when Sameer Thakur arrived, and the atmosphere around him shifted immediately. Sameer was a tall, muscular man with sharp eyes that seemed to scan every corner of a room before anyone else noticed him. His reputation preceded him, involved in underground financial operations that spanned India and the United States. A man who had been arrested before but had connections powerful enough to keep him moving through the system with surprising ease. When he was placed in the same block as Raghav, the change was subtle at first, a glance lingering a moment too long, a shadow passing by Raghav's cell at night, but the effect was unmistakable. Raghav felt an old buried fear rise within him, a fear that had nothing to do with the prison itself and everything to do with this man. Their connection went back further than most could guess. Years earlier, in Delhi, Raghav had briefly worked for a company where Sameer had influence behind the scenes. Raghav had processed documents, signed papers and carried out simple accounting tasks, never realizing that some of those actions had indirectly benefited Sameer's financial network. At the time, Raghav thought he was just doing his job, unaware of the powerful and dangerous figures he had brushed against. Now, years later, in a foreign prison, he realized that Sameer had remembered him. The recognition alone made Raghav shiver. He understood that Sameer wasn't here by accident, and the thought of facing someone with both knowledge and intent made him feel exposed in ways he had never experienced before. As days passed, Raghav's paranoia grew. Sameer never approached him directly, never spoke to him, but his presence was enough. The subtle intimidation was constant. A look during meals, a shadow in the corner of the yard, footsteps echoing at times when no one else was near. Raghav tried to focus on survival, keeping his routines, avoiding eye contact, sitting quietly in the common areas, but every small movement of Sameer's seemed purposeful, directed toward him. He became hyper-aware of everything around him, listening for voices, studying every shift in behavior, trying to anticipate threats he couldn't identify fully. Sleep became impossible. Raghav would lie on the thin mattress of his cell, staring at the ceiling, heart racing, mind replaying every encounter he had ever had with Sameer. He thought of Delhi offices, of papers he had signed, of decisions he had made without realizing the consequences. The realization that his past had followed him across continents and into this heavily secured facility made his fear tangible. He stopped eating properly, forcing himself to remain alert even during the night, convinced that a single lapse could bring danger closer. Every sound, the slam of a door, a distant shout, the echo of footsteps, felt amplified, a signal of impending threat. The psychological toll was immense. Raghav began to document his fears in a small notebook, writing down every observation, every interaction, and every suspicion he had about Sameer's motives. He hid the notebook in a vent in his cell, fearing that if anything happened to him, at least someone might understand what he had endured. Despite being surrounded by concrete walls and metal bars, he felt more exposed than ever. The prison was no longer merely a place of punishment. It had become a stage for an invisible game, and Raghav feared he was already losing. Each day without incident was a day of temporary relief, but he knew it would not last. Sameer was patient, calculating, and Raghav understood that his presence here was a warning, a constant reminder that the past, no matter how far you run, could reach you anyway. Raghav realized that staying invisible was no longer enough. The quiet paranoia that had begun with Sameer's arrival escalated into a constant, gnawing fear that he could never shake. He tried to maintain a routine, waking at dawn, eating the sparse meals, attending the limited prison activities, but every step was shadowed by tension. Even the simplest movements, like walking to the bathroom or stepping into the yard, felt like calculated risks. He began avoiding communal areas entirely, spending hours alone on the hard bunk of his cell. The isolation, however, only amplified his anxiety. Without anyone to confide in, his thoughts became a dangerous spiral, replaying moments from the past and imagining every possible scenario in which he could be harmed. Raghav considered asking for a transfer, hoping that another block or even another facility would distance him from Sameer. He submitted requests through the proper channels, citing his fear and mental distress, but the bureaucracy moved slowly, and the officers reviewing his petitions dismissed them without much thought. They labeled his claims as paranoia, noting that no overt threats had been made. To them, he was just another inmate with anxiety issues. To Raghav, the denial felt like a verdict, a silent message that he had no protection and no one to rely on. He began to internalize the prison's indifference as a dangerous reality. If he wanted to survive, he could only rely on himself. As the days stretched into weeks, Raghav's mental and physical state deteriorated. He stopped eating properly and his once disciplined habits slipped away. The hunger and lack of sleep left him weak, but he felt unable to surrender completely. Afraid that showing weakness would make him an even easier target, he devised ways to stay alert, like sitting in unusual positions, keeping his eyes constantly moving, and listening for patterns in the footsteps and voices that surrounded him. Every noise, no matter how minor, felt like a potential signal of approaching danger. His small notebook became his lifeline. He recorded every detail he could remember about interactions with Sameer, the behavior of other inmates, and the peculiarities of the prison staff. The notebook was hidden in a vent, an attempt to preserve his observations in case he didn't survive to share them himself. The notebook grew into a mix of fears, warnings, and fragmented recollections of events from his life before prison. He sketched diagrams of the cell block, noting blind spots and areas where he could potentially be cornered. He listed names and connections, some he barely remembered, others that made him shiver to recall. Each entry was an effort to piece together a strategy for survival, yet he knew no strategy could guarantee safety in a place where rules were fluid and danger was often invisible. The more he wrote, the more he realized that the threats around him were not random. Sameer's presence, combined with the prison's apathy, made the environment not just hostile but lethal. Raghav's desperation reached a point where even the few comforts of human routine, reading, stretching, or exercising, felt pointless. His mind was consumed by anticipation, every moment dominated by a fear that someone would act on the quiet threat that hung over him. The small vent above his bed became both a hiding place and a symbol of hope, a secret he clung to in a world that no longer felt safe. Each day was measured in survival, each night in vigilance. The physical walls of the prison were no longer his greatest barrier. It was the invisible network of fear, power, and secrets that surrounded him. Raghav understood painfully that in this environment surviving another day required more than caution. It demanded constant, unrelenting awareness, and even then, it might not be enough. Raghav's body and mind were fraying, and it became impossible for him to ignore the weight of his fear any longer. The exhaustion from constant vigilance had reached a breaking point. He found himself collapsing during routine cell checks, his legs unable to carry him, his chest tightening in panic. The guards initially assumed it was mere fatigue or stress, a common complaint among new inmates, but Raghav's condition was far deeper than simple tiredness. He could barely speak when medical personnel arrived, his breaths coming in short, sharp bursts, and his hands trembling uncontrollably. He tried to explain the sense of danger that had been following him relentlessly, the feeling that every shadow could harbor someone who wanted him harmed, but his words faltered. No one truly grasped the depth of the threat he felt, a danger that existed outside the laws, outside the walls, and yet seemed closer with every passing day. The prison authorities, concerned by the sudden collapse, placed him under special observation. Guards were assigned to monitor him at intervals, and medical staff checked his vitals more frequently. On the surface, it seemed like a protective measure, but to Raghav, added attention was almost as terrifying as the isolation he had endured before. Every movement of the staff, every glance in his direction, felt like a reminder that he was now exposed in a different way. The constant presence of others could not alleviate the sense of imminent threat. If anything, it heightened it. He remained convinced that Sameer Thakur, or someone connected to him, would not allow him to remain in this state for long, that the invisible network that had haunted him for years could reach him even through these protective measures. Raghav's sleep became even more elusive. Nights stretched endlessly, and the small cell felt increasingly like a trap rather than a sanctuary. He would lie on the thin mattress, staring at the flickering shadows cast by the dim lights, heart pounding in anticipation of every footstep or door slam. He began to ration his limited energy carefully, moving only when necessary, conserving mental strength for moments that demanded alertness. The physical pain was constant, a tightness in his chest, tension in his shoulders, headaches that blurred the edges of his vision, but the mental torment was far worse. He had learned that weakness, even perceived, could invite danger. His body was failing, but his mind refused to surrender entirely. Survival had become a delicate balance between maintaining some semblance of strength and avoiding complete collapse. In the midst of this fragile equilibrium, he turned even more obsessively to the notebook he had hidden in the vent above his bed. Each page became a lifeline, a record of observations, strategies, and warnings. He sketched layouts of the cell block, noting the routines of inmates and guards alike, marking the patterns that could be exploited or avoided. He documented every interaction with Sameer, every lingering look and subtle movement that had unsettled him since the man's arrival. Even as his body weakened, his mind worked tirelessly, mapping threats and searching for any possible advantage. Writing became his method of control in a world where control was otherwise impossible. Despite these efforts, Raghav knew that his time in the prison was wearing him down faster than he could recover. He felt as though each day brought him closer to a breaking point he could not withstand. The sense of impending danger, combined with physical and emotional exhaustion, left him certain of one truth: he could not survive another day in this place without consequences. His fear was no longer abstract. It was a tangible, suffocating presence that colored every moment, and in the back of his mind a chilling realization persisted. If he could not endure the relentless pressure, someone else might ensure that his survival ended permanently. The week after Raghav's collapse brought an eerie tension to the prison that no one could explain. The guards went about their routines, but subtle changes began to emerge. Security cameras recorded anomalies, footage that appeared to freeze momentarily, glitches in the recordings that coincided with the dead of night. These blind spots were unusual, And although the surveillance team attempted to investigate, the anomalies could not be replicated during the day. Raghav, already hyper-aware, noticed the irregularities almost immediately. He could sense when the camera's attention faltered, and a deep unease settled over him. He had spent weeks meticulously observing patterns and routines, yet these new inconsistencies felt deliberate, as though someone with knowledge of the system was manipulating it for a purpose he could not yet understand. The nights became unbearable. Raghav had grown accustomed to isolating himself, listening intently to the sounds around him, but now the faintest noises seemed amplified and meaningful. He heard footsteps echoing where there should have been none, soft rustling in the corridor outside his cell, and the occasional whisper of metal against metal that did not belong to any known inmate routine. Even the guards seemed to move with unusual timing, though whether by accident or design, Raghav could not tell. He clutched his notebook each night, jotting down every discrepancy, every sensation of being watched, every deviation from the norm. It was no longer enough to record Sameer's movements or his own observations. Raghav had to document the unknown, the invisible threat that seemed to linger just out of reach. On the night that changed everything, the prison lights flickered during the late shift, plunging the cell block into brief, stuttering darkness. In those moments, Raghav felt a presence near his cell. The silence was broken only by the faint scuffle of hurried footsteps, moving in a direction that brought them closer and then suddenly retreating. His heart raced violently, and a cold sweat coated his skin. By the time the lights returned to full brightness, the corridor was empty, the guards unaware of any anomaly. Raghav, however, sensed that the night had brought him closer to an irreversible event. He could feel the anticipation, the quiet culmination of weeks of fear, drawing near. When the guards checked on him later, they found him still awake, clutching his notebook, eyes wide with terror. The unusual events of the night had left an indelible mark on him, confirming the truth he had long suspected. He was being targeted, and no official system could protect him. Hours later, when the next round of checks occurred, Raghav was discovered lifeless in his cell. There was no forced entry, no visible weapon, no fingerprints other than his own. His body lay rigid, his face frozen in the unmistakable expression of someone who had seen death coming and could do nothing to stop it. The prison staff was baffled. Surveillance footage, already flawed, offered no answers. The blind spots during the flickering lights remained unexplained, leaving investigators without leads. Even the medical examination could not determine a definitive cause. It seemed that Raghav had succumbed to circumstances beyond ordinary understanding, a lethal combination of fear, vulnerability, and unseen intervention. The only clue left behind was the small notebook he had hidden in the vent, a record of observation and dread detailing threats, routines, and suspicions that at the time no one could fully interpret. It was a silent testament to his final days, the document of a mind pushed to the edge, and the only trace of the invisible forces that had converged on him that night. The investigation into Raghav's death began immediately, but it quickly became clear that it was a case full of gaps and unanswered questions. Prison officials interviewed inmates, guards, and medical staff, searching for any clue that could explain how a man under special observation had ended up dead in a seemingly secure cell. Every detail was scrutinized, yet the answers remained elusive. The guards who had been assigned to Raghav noted nothing unusual during their shifts, and the medical staff reported that his vitals had appeared stable only hours before his death. The surveillance footage was fragmented, with unexplained glitches during the critical hours. It was as if the prison itself had conspired to hide the events of that night, leaving investigators frustrated and puzzled. Sameer Thakur was among the first inmates questioned. Authorities wanted to understand the nature of his relationship with Raghav, and whether any direct involvement could be proven. Sameer denied any connection, presenting himself as cooperative, calm, and unthreatening. There was no evidence linking him to the death, no footprints, no weapon, no traces of any struggle. Despite this, officers could not ignore the history between the two men. Raghav's notebooks had detailed subtle observations about Sameer's presence, the way he watched, the way he seemed to move in sync with shifts in the prison schedule. Even without direct proof, there was a growing suspicion that Raghav's fear had not been unfounded. When investigators examined the vent above Raghav's bed, they found the notebook he had hidden so carefully. It was filled with pages of meticulous notes, sketches of the cell block, and lists of people connected to a wider financial network. The handwriting was frantic in places, reflecting the growing anxiety that had consumed him. The notebook contained names, dates, and incomplete descriptions of activities that suggested a web of criminal operations extending far beyond the prison walls. Whoever had wanted Raghav silenced had reasons that were far-reaching, and the information he had compiled now offered a small window into that world. Investigators understood that if these notes were authentic, they could provide leads for financial crimes on an international scale. Yet the notebook was incomplete. Pages ended mid-sentence, thoughts were left unfinished, and certain sections appeared deliberately obscured, perhaps because Raghav hadn't had time to fully document everything. This made it clear that he had been interrupted, that something or someone had ensured he could not complete his work. For the investigators, the challenge became twofold: understanding what had led to his death, and determining how much of the criminal network he had exposed without realizing it. The prison's blind spots and glitches now seemed even more sinister, as though the environment itself had been manipulated to allow someone access without leaving a trace. Amid the confusion, Sameer Thakur was quietly transferred to another facility. The timing raised eyebrows among staff and outside observers alike, but official explanations cited routine administrative reasons. He was placed under tighter surveillance, yet his movements seemed calculated, as if he were aware of what had occurred and how to avoid detection. Raghav's death remained officially unexplained, but the combination of his notebook, the irregularities in the security system, and Sameer's presence left investigators and prison officials with a lingering unease. The case was a reminder that within these walls, power and fear could move unseen, and that even the most secure systems could be compromised when someone had knowledge, intent, and the patience to act. The truth behind Raghav Verma's final hours remained buried in shadows, documented only in his frantic notes and the memories of those who watched helpless as events unfolded. Raghav Verma's death was officially ruled as unexplained, but the people who had observed him closely knew the truth was far more complicated. The official reports painted a sterile picture: an inmate under observation, found lifeless in his cell, with no signs of struggle or forced entry. To the untrained eye, it might have seemed like a tragic accident, perhaps a result of stress or a medical condition. Yet those who had studied his behavior, his fears, and the meticulous notebook he left behind, understood that Raghav had not simply succumbed to circumstance. He had been the target of forces that operated beyond the visible boundaries of the prison, invisible powers that ensured his silence in the most permanent way possible. The notebook became the focal point of ongoing federal inquiry. Investigators pored over the names, dates, and cryptic notes Raghav had left behind. Some entries referenced financial transfers, shell companies, and individuals with ties to international networks, all hinting at crimes that extended well beyond his own involvement. Analysts recognized that the notebook contained fragments of a larger operation, pieces that could have exposed a web of illicit activity spanning continents. Raghav had documented these details carefully, almost instinctively, as if he knew that survival might depend on leaving evidence behind. Yet even with this lifeline, the investigation faced enormous challenges. Many of the names were aliases, accounts had been wiped or transferred, and the people connected to the network were elusive, protected by layers of anonymity and influence. Sameer Thakur, whose presence in the prison had terrified Raghav, was quietly moved to another facility shortly after the death. Though officially described as a routine administrative transfer, the timing raised suspicions among staff and investigators. In his new location, he was placed under stricter surveillance, yet there was no evidence linking him directly to the murder. Despite this, anyone who studied the events surrounding Raghav's final days could not ignore the coincidence. The meticulous notes, the anomalies in the surveillance footage, and Sameer's calculated movements created a pattern that suggested intent, even if proof remained elusive. Outside the prison, federal investigators initiated further inquiries based on the fragments Raghav had documented. Some leads uncovered minor financial irregularities, accounts frozen or redirected, and intermediaries questioned about connections they barely admitted to knowing. Yet much of the larger network remained hidden, as if deliberately shielding itself from scrutiny. Raghav's notebook had opened a door, but the deeper structures of the criminal operations he had observed remained shrouded in secrecy. The very people he had feared continued their work, unseen and untouchable. Raghav's death left a lingering sense of unease among those who had known him, both inmates and officers. The prison staff remembered a man consumed by fear, yet driven to document every detail, every anomaly, every observation. His vigilance, even in his final days, had left a trail that might one day expose the truth. Yet the unanswered questions, how someone had accessed him, what precise role Sameer or others had played, and how the syndicate had ensured his silence remained buried in shadows. Ultimately, Raghav's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even within the most controlled environments, danger could move unseen, and truth could be silenced with quiet precision. His life ended behind bars, yet his meticulous notes offered a glimpse into a world far larger and far more dangerous than the prison walls themselves. While the official case remained unresolved, the silent testament of Raghav Verma served as evidence of a chilling reality. Knowledge, fear, and power could converge in ways that no system could fully contain, and sometimes the only certainty was that he could not, and would not, survive another day.